Shane, are we good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is Labor Day weekend, Sunday, September 3rd. We are broadcasting live from Houston, Texas. And this is our Teaching Sunday segment of our program. I want to talk about causes and conditions. There's a lot of teachings in Buddhism on what we call dependent origination. And simply put, dependent origination is a teaching that looks at the causes and conditions for how things arise and cease. Shane, can you pull this speaker so that it's pointing forward because it's giving us some feedback? If you get it. If you get it actually forward of me a little bit. A little bit further. Let's try that. Hello, hello, hello. So the teaching of dependent origination is, how do things come into being? How does ignorance arise? How does ignorance cease? Ignorance which leads to bondage. How does bondage cease? How does suffering cease? So the whole elaborate teachings of Buddhism are teachings on causes and conditions. If we look at teachings on causes and conditions, we could look at things kind of objectively and quote scientifically. And in a way, the whole scientific enterprise, and I'm sitting here with a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry, the whole scientific enterprise, supported by a Cartesian philosophical framework, was aimed at disenchanting our engagement with reality. Quite successfully so. We, for the most part in our culture, live in a fairly disenchanted universe. And I realized as I was preparing what I was going to talk about that what I am going to talk about could be taken in a very disenchanted manner, and that's not my intention. I actually would encourage you to take what I have to say in a large frame of curiosity and wonder. Curiosity and wonder are really, really wonderful terms. Wonderful. Wonder is a wonderful term, and curiosity. Charles Taylor, who is a Catholic philosopher, I think up in the University of Toronto, has a book called Sources of the Self, and he's got a chapter in that book on the Puritans. And I may be hallucinating because it's been a while since I've looked at the book, but I think the title was God is an adverb. And going back to elementary school, what are adverbs? How, when, and why. So how we take in a teaching and how we take in a consideration of, let's say, a teaching on causes and conditions is very, very important. And I really offer it in a kind of attitude of sacredness and wonder and curiosity. You know, descriptively, if you look at causes and conditions, not too long ago, a few years ago, I needed to take a course in anatomy and physiology, which I'd never studied in high school or college. And at some point, they were describing how the kidney works. And they were getting down into these little filaments in the kidney, and in one area of the kidney, there's a certain pH, which is how acidic or basic the environment is for the kidney to be working. And then in another area of the kidney, the pH was slightly different. And it's like, holy cow, this is crazy. I mean, how do we survive? I mean, the pH in one part of the kidney is this way, and the pH is another part. There are these little filaments. So much could go wrong. It's an absolute miracle that we're alive. And every part of the body is like that. I mean, if we look at a cell, I'm sure there's a particular pH in the cell and outside the cell. It's a miracle. It's causes and conditions. There's a pH here and a pH there. Here a pH, there a pH, everywhere a pH. It's causes and conditions. Of course, when we get sick, our causes and conditions are imbalanced. But when you start looking at how delicate everything is in the body, in plants, our climate, it's filled with miraculous displays of causes and conditions operating successfully. You know, if we're into the arts, we look at ballet, we look at the Impressionists. What were the Impressionists doing when they were painting? They were looking at the causes and conditions for creating an impression of something. So they started deconstructing objects into pieces and parts, causes and conditions. The Impressionists, as far as I'm concerned, were Buddhists, untitled Buddhists. Causes and conditions of the impressions that we get, down to people who were doing pointillistic painting. They were basically painting with pixels before pixels were invented. Causes and conditions. I, for whatever reason, enjoy cooking. There's a wonderful episode in The Chef's Table. It's the first episode in The Chef's Table, which is a Netflix, on a Korean nun who is also a cook. I think her name is Jung Kwan. Absolutely unbelievable, something to watch. Cooking is a spiritual endeavor, food as a spiritual expression. Soy sauce, it turns out, is the basis of reality, which I happen to agree with. Causes and conditions. So when we come to a practice of meditation, and certainly for the initial phases of meditation practice, which can last for decades, we're working with causes and conditions to support our practice. In the teachings of Buddhism, there are three jewels, also three sources of refuge. They're the same. What is a refuge? A refuge is a cause and condition that offers safety. And they all have to do with causes and conditions that support practice. The first, in Tibetan Buddhism, they had a fourth jewel, the teacher, the living teacher, called the Lama. So there's a living teacher as a cause and condition for us learning how to do something like meditate. So, I mean, a book is a physical manifestation of a teacher. Here, the book we're reading nowadays is Pema Chodron. She's a teacher. So this is a cause and condition for our practice. The Lama. The Buddha, who started it all over 2,500 years ago, and we'll be starting to talk about the basics of Buddhism on Sundays starting September 17th, half hour like this at 10:30. The Buddha started it all with his teachings. So knowing what the Buddha said is a cause and condition for our practice. It's not just like a physical, abstract, scientific cause and condition. There's something wonderful about it. It's wondrous. And if we're curious about it, it's sustaining in an emotional way. And what the Buddha taught is called the Dharma, the teachings. So there's the main teacher, there's the living teacher, the representative of the Buddha. And then there's the community, the Sangha. That's us, fellow practitioners. You know, in our culture, we value autonomy to a fault. The initial explorers were undoubtedly extremely autonomous to have the gumption to get on a boat and sail out of Europe and find their way to the Western Hemisphere. A lot of autonomy involved in that. And then we go back to the likes of John Locke's philosophy in England, where things are getting described in very atomistic terms and autonomy terms, and autonomy has taken us a long way. I mean, you had to be very, very brave in the early years of our history to go from the east to the west, get into a wagon or get on a horse and gallop out into Lord knows what you were facing. But that dominant culture or theme loses sight of community. And Sangha really just means a coalescence, a coming together. But in the Buddhist context, it's the coming together of the community, the spiritual community. And many people writing over the last decades looking at Western Buddhism will often say that, you know, in Western Buddhism, people pay attention to 2 out of 3 jewels, namely the Buddha and his teachings, but not enough to the community. And so our community supports us. People on screen are supporting us and one another. We're supporting one another by coming here physically and being present. I think some of us got some sense of the kind of intangible meaning of that kind of support when we were on lockdown for 2.5 years, and what it meant not to be having contact with people in an ongoing physical manner. It means something to be in connection with people physically. And it means something to be connecting with people in a simultaneous experience, online and in person. It's a support. It's a cause and condition for our practice. When we teach, we talk about pillars of support. These are causes and conditions. We touch into our experience of sitting. What is it like to be sitting? That grounds us in the present. That is a cause and condition that supports meditation. We sense into our skeletal structure, and we realize that it is supporting us, and with some mindfulness we acknowledge that support. That helps settle us. We sense into that there can be a central channel of energy in the center of our core, that kind of just can serve as a support. That's a cause and condition for our practice. When we are practicing mindfulness of the breathing, two important causes and conditions for support and for success is that we place our attention on the breath. That's a function of mind that is described in the teachings, placing the attention on the object. And then we sustain our attention on the object. That's another kind of function of mind. It's a little bit different than just putting your mind on something. It's like holding it there. Those are two causes and conditions that support our practice of mindfulness of the breathing. Mindfulness is being able to put our mind on the breath. It's like the lens of our mind is on the breath. We're looking at the mind, the breathing. That's a cause and condition. It's important to appreciate how to take such teachings in. It's not that we start engineering ourselves, although I have a deep kind of engineering DNA, and so my own inclination is to kind of lean that way. But you don't want to hyper-engineer yourself. You want to be a good friend to yourself. You want to work with instructions in a caring manner. And that is a cause and condition for supporting your practice. You want to care for yourself. It's not like you need to chisel your way into being a different something. It's how can you cooperatively work with yourself to develop a new talent, a new skill. One of the causes and conditions for our success in practice has to do with confidence that something is going to happen. Sometimes that confidence is even described as faith. You start thinking about it, and if I think back on my own life, why would I sit down for 5 minutes or 50 years to meditate? A great question. And anybody who sits down for 5 minutes or 15 minutes or 5 days in a row, there's some inherent, at least question mark and positivity. I think something could happen doing this. I mean, really start thinking about it. Why would I continue to do something like that unless I had some confidence, sometimes translated as faith, that something is going to change in me? We all work on a kind of internal, inherent risk-benefit analysis, and we don't do things that we don't think are going to be some kind of benefit for us, although, of course, almost all of us are engaged in some kinds of habits and activities that are not, quote, good for us. But for the most part, we do things that we think are going to be beneficial. So if you backtrack a little bit, if you've got any practice of exercise, diet, any kind of regimen, causes and conditions that keep us doing that regimen, studying if we're students, so we think it's going to work. I'm going to read this passage tonight because I think I can get a better grade on my test tomorrow. There's some kind of confidence that reviewing material will be of benefit to me. It's not a small thing because we occasionally meet people who are total skeptics and, I don't believe you. I'm not going to sit down and meditate for 5 minutes. That's not going to work. And they can't do it because they don't have confidence. I think sometimes when I hear some of my Christian brethren talk, they may talk about faith as a kind of grace. And if you start thinking about it, there's absolute truth in that statement. Confidence and faith are causes and conditions for ongoing practice. And they're a kind of grace that if we don't have them, and you see somebody who's lacking confidence in the diverse areas of their lives, it's terrible. They can't do what they need to be doing because they don't have confidence. I think maybe the last thing I'll talk about by way of causes and conditions supportive of practice is to really have a sense of caring for oneself in a really kind, gentle, and tender manner. Many individuals are drawn to kind of spiritual practice and take guidelines for practice to become an excuse for self-punishment. This is a very widespread issue. And it's painful to behold, also common to behold. And so when we take on a discipline, it's a bit of a fine-tuning to be able to recognize that, yes, I wish to change my behavior. Yes, I wish to undertake some kind of discipline. I will meditate 5 minutes, or I will meditate 15 minutes, I will meditate 30 minutes. I will do a retreat for a weekend. These are all choices, and these all take some discipline and decision making. And can we alert ourselves to do that kind of choice making without a surplus of self-criticism, self-judgment, self-flagellation? It's very, very important to continue to check in with ourselves. Are we working in a kind, self-caring atmosphere? As I undertake a discipline of meditation, am I doing it with kindness to myself and concern for myself? Or am I standing with a metaphoric whip in my hand, whipping myself with some kind of coarse or subtle form of self-rejection? You know, when we practice and we get distracted, it's a wonderful moment to not be harsh on oneself, not self-rejecting, not hateful of oneself. We're practicing, we're focusing on the breathing, we got distracted, we kind of eventually come out of it. We recognize we've been distracted. We can, if it's helpful, just thinking, and we bring our attention back. You know, those of all of us who are parents, if you're raising a child, you know, when they fall off their bike, is it like, you should never fall off your bike? Or is it, of course you fall off your bike, that's part of learning how to ride a bike. We get back on and we try again. No big whoop. And of course, anybody who's seen people parenting, there's a whole range of parenting out there. But when we fall off our mindfulness bike, we should be kind with ourselves. And of course we get distracted. We're human. We just thinking, and we turn our attention to the breath. So with that, I will conclude my remarks for the morning. We may need a moment, I don't know, to transition to the meditation program. And we'll take that moment. And in about half a minute, we will start the meditation. Do you want to, why don't you just come sit here? It's going to be easier to do.